Hello, my name is Jack Sidnell, and I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Toronto. I was fortunate enough to be awarded a 6-month Jackman Humanities Institute Faculty Research Fellowship for the fall of 2024, and I've made this video to tell you about what I did during my time as a fellow. The project I'm working on explores an important but largely overlooked dimension of the Vietnamese Communist Revolution, spanning from its origins in the political insurgencies of the mid-1920s through its military victory at Dien Bien Phu and the land reform campaigns of the mid to late 1950s. Specifically, I examine how both revolutionary leaders and low-level cadres sought to transform consciousness through the introduction of novel interactional genres, that is, new ways of speaking, listening, reading, and writing that had the potential to reshape not only how people related to one another, but also how they understood themselves, and so ultimately to fundamentally remake self and society. So let me quickly share my slides. In early May 1954, Comrade Lê Thu arrived in the village of Dom Kiem with instructions to bring the revolutionary message of the Communist Party to poor peasants and landless laborers. To do this, Lê Thu would visit the poor and ask about their suffering. If she could persuade peasants to talk about their experience of hardship, she could then skillfully pose questions that would help transform apparently personal afflictions into the raw material for a jointly constructed narrative of class struggle. Through this process, peasants and laborers would come to see that their suffering resulted from economic exploitation rather than laziness, that it was not something to be ashamed of, and that it was certainly not a matter of cosmically ordained fate. But first, Lê Thu would need to seize the root, which is to say, identify from among the poorest villagers a person who could serve as a local guide and who, once adequately trained, would help her bring these revolutionary ideas to still other poor peasants and hired hands. Arriving in the village, Lê Thu went first to Brother Ming, the head of the Agricultural Association and a party member, but soon discovered that his family controlled numerous rice fields and owned several buffalo, thereby disqualifying him as a possible route. Lê Thu, the next morning, Lê Thu had Ming summarize the village's class composition and identify the most wretched families, but her investigations revealed problems with each of his suggestions. Lê Thu now went to the home of Auntie Dak, whom Brother Ming had included in the category of relatively well-off middle peasants, and found her pulling up yams. Lê Thu immediately joined Auntie Dak in her work and through skillful questioning, learned that she was in fact one of the poorest agricultural laborers in the village. Lê Thu set about practicing the three togethers of eating, living, and working with Auntie Dak, and over a period of several days elicited a narrative of her suffering. When Auntie Dak told of her many hardships, including the death of 3 infant children as well as her husband, Lê Thu encouraged her to compare these circumstances with those of the landowner Kup, for whom she often worked as a laborer. Satisfied that Auntie Dak was now able to see that her difficulties were the result of economic exploitation, Lê Thu asked her what poor peasants and laborers might do to alleviate their suffering. Auntie Dak replied that the poor must band together to fight the landowners, and and that to this end she would devote herself completely to whatever work the land reform cadres assigned to her. I'll come back to the story of Comrade Lê Thu and Auntie Dak, but before doing so, we need to briefly consider the larger context in which these events took place. Specifically, I want to suggest that Lê Thu was working on the front line of an ambitious project of language reform that communist revolutionaries, and especially Ho Chi Minh, had initiated some 10 years earlier when they first took control of a significant part of northern Vietnam. At its most general, the goal of this project was to remake the Vietnamese language in such a way as to promote effective communication between often relatively well-educated communist cadres and mostly illiterate peasant masses. This had emerged as a problem, according to communist revolutionaries, because over several hundred years of foreign influence, the Vietnamese language had become overwrought and excessively esoteric. Thus, in a scathing critique of a speech style he referred to as Bahua, Ho Chi Minh wrote, "Because in the past we learned Chinese characters and then after that studied French, when we speak or write, we often use Chinese words and follow the French style, which is verbose and difficult to understand, indeed, hardly intelligible." Ho Chi Minh insisted that cadres purge their speech of excessively technical and esoteric vocabulary, and that they speak and write in such a way that anyone could understand. And so, by identifying a speech style to be avoided, Ho Chi Minh promoted its mirror opposite, a way of speaking that was simple, direct, concise, and effective. The attempt to establish such a communicative register was one vitally important front upon which the Communist project of language reform proceeded. Another aspect of the project focused less on communicative style than on what I describe as interactional genres. Thus, all the while that they were campaigning against excessive nouniness and an over-reliance on Chinese words and technical terms, communist leaders and high-ranking cadres were introducing new interactional scenarios and communicative frameworks which they believed would help to induce or to strengthen revolutionary consciousness. Three such interactional genres were particularly important in this respect. First, party cadres were required to take part in group criticism sessions in the course of which they were to speak freely and directly to superiors, pointing out their defects and shortcomings without the usual displays of deference. Second, those classified as intellectuals were expected to attend re-education classes and to engage in soul-searching self-examination, later written up in reports and submitted to party officials for evaluation and assessment. And third, poor peasants were encouraged to speak in new narrative forms, through which they might articulate their suffering and identify landowners as the root cause of their misery. These new genres introduce complex forms of social mediation and innovative ways of relating to oneself and to others, and Vietnamese revolutionaries believed that participation in them would transform consciousness, whether by strengthening cadres' revolutionary stance, by helping intellectuals to shed the skin of their petit bourgeois origins, or by allowing peasants to see through a mystifying veil of feudal relations to the stark reality of economic exploitation. In what time I have left today, I'll focus on the third genre, the elicitation and narration of suffering, the process through which, as we saw in Leithu's report, the masses, particularly poor peasants and agricultural laborers, would be drawn into the revolutionary movement and their consciousness would be transformed. As the slogans "Visit with the poor" and "Ask about their suffering" and "Where there is suffering, let it be expressed, the peasants will rise up" already suggest, the methods of mass mobilization were not described as a means to indoctrinate peasants or others, to impose an ideology, or even in liberal terms to persuade people conceived of as autonomous free-willed individuals to join the revolutionary cause. On the contrary, the idea was that, with help from the cadres, peasants would come to see the stark reality of economic exploitation for themselves. In this respect, the methods of mass mobilization I describe here were consistent with the principles that Ho Chi Minh laid out in his extended essay titled "Fixing the Way We Work," published in 1947. There, Ho Chi Minh insists that cadres must not engage in what he calls "nhoi sa," which literally means skull cramming, but can be more idiomatically translated as brainwashing, a kind of persuasion that effectively bypasses intelligent reception. The first-person narrative reports of cadres Lei Tu, as well as Ding Ban Qing and Hung, describe an approach to mass mobilization that involved using questions to prompt poor peasants and agricultural laborers to disclose their experiences of hardship. Once these experiences were revealed, subsequent provocations guided peasant interlocutors to identify the sources of their suffering in relations of exploitation. The goal, then, was to elicit not merely an enumeration of hardships, but what might be called a narrative analysis, a coherent account that reframed individual suffering as the product of systematic class exploitation. To elicit such politically structured narratives, cadres practice what I call provocative reception, a combination of strategic listening techniques and calculated responses. This involved attending carefully to peasant testimony for evidence that their suffering stemmed from landlord exploitation, then responding in ways that guided peasants toward recognizing these class dynamics and developing revolutionary consciousness. While, while cadres employed these practices in powerful combinations, they can be described independently for analytical purposes. So perhaps the most basic form this took was one in which the cadre, while working together with the poor peasant or laborer, would first remark on the difficulty of the task, and then, after the peasant assented to this, would ask whether a specific landlord or rich families in general also had to work in this way. For example, while standing in frigid waters digging for shrimp with Sister Meng, Comrade Ding Van Ching asked, "Landlord Tuan's family has rice and soup. They never have to go catch shrimp, right?" To this, Sister Menk responded, "He never has to lift a finger. Whenever he's hungry, he just spends pocket change and eats his fill. Meanwhile, I have to slave away catching shrimp to sell to him." This technique bears comparison to Lenin's discussion of exposures in What Is to Be Done. There, Lenin suggests that the revolutionary energies of Russian workers were much amplified by the production of a literature exposing economic conditions, thereby providing mental food for workers of all trades and at all stages of development. Likewise, the ostensive technique of Vietnamese cadres constituted a form of exposure that made class exploitation visible through the immediate, undeniable reality of physically demanding labor. The combination of ostensive reference to immediately present circumstances on the one hand, and invited comparison to the very different situation of landlords and wealthy families on the other, provided Vietnamese cadres with a powerful tool, a lever of mediation, quote, with which to overcome the mere immediacy of the empirical world, thus positioning peasant suffering in relation to the larger social formation or totality. Through this reframing, what initially appeared as individual misfortune became visible as the result of systematic class exploitation. The technique thus aimed not merely to expose conditions, but to fundamentally alter how peasants understood the nature and causes of their suffering. A closely related technique involved counterfactual speculation, in which cadres drew comparisons between current circumstances and what might have been possible without landlord exploitation. Like the techniques of vivid exposure, this method interrupted the immediate experience of hardship by resituating it within broader social processes that operate across classes rather than affecting individuals in isolation. For instance, while sowing and fertilizing rice seedlings with Auntie Menk, Comrade Ding Van Ching observed that if she owned the land they worked, she could retain the entire harvest. Under the actual sharecropping arrangement, however, Auntie Menk and her husband were left with very little despite their intensive effort. Auntie Menk's response captures this stark reality. Quote, "Oh, we work the land as sharecroppers, uncle. After the harvest, the rice is completely used up, and we must gather firewood just to make ends meet. We're short of food 7 to 8 months of the year." The counterfactual thus draws attention to exploitative economic relations, reframing material hardship as the product of a particular social arrangement and distribution of property, one that could have been otherwise. A final technique of provocative reception can be described as, quote, give to get. This involved the cadre sharing their own experience of hardship to promote mutual identification and to prompt from the peasant laborer a reciprocal narrative of suffering. For example, to win over the initially resistant Kai, Comrade Hung first asked extremely provocative questions to rouse her anger, and when this elicited a brief account of the death of Kai's parents, she attempted to establish an intimate connection and induce Kai to reveal more of her story by telling Kai about the death of her own father and mother. She says, Kai, my parents also died of starvation. Often when I hold a bowl of rice in my hands, I can't help but think about that time. I choke up with tears and am unable to swallow. In response, Kai, quote, changed her tone, now referring to herself as M, younger sibling, while prior to this she used Chow, niece or nephew. Underlying this practice is a conception of suffering as a kind of trauma, which may initially resist explicit articulation. In some cases, there is the clear implication that outward, immediately expressed hostility masks real pain or feelings of guilt and shame. In order to get past such superficial outward appearances to real inner emotion, cadres had to establish the rapport and relation of mutual understanding that would facilitate this. To conclude, in a classic work of liberal theory, Kant suggested that enlightenment is man's release from his self-incurred tutelage. On this view, enlightenment is equated with the autonomous use of one's reason, without interference from others, and intelligence is degraded by outside influence. Consistent with this Kantian liberalism, the mass mobilization campaign of the Vietnamese communists has long been characterized by historians and political scientists as a project of indoctrination, the imposition from above of a totalizing ideological framework on those below. In other words, these scholars have tended to reduce revolutionary education to skull cramming, ironically, the very approach that Ho Chi Minh explicitly rejected. In contrast, what I've presented today suggests that this was not solely a matter of imposing on peasants a preformed and rigid ideology, or of interpolating them as the undifferentiated oppressed masses. Rather, cadres like Lei Tu, Hung, and Ding Ban Qing aimed to initiate dialogue, to elicit from the poor peasants and laborers they worked with narrative renderings of their suffering, to promote and provoke them, and to invite them to compare their own circumstances with those who controlled the means of production, especially agricultural land. In other words, cadres encouraged poor peasants and agricultural laborers to see what was already there, but to see it in a different light. To do this, they introduced new ways of representing reality in the form of innovative genres of interaction, including those I've described as the elicitation of suffering. I hope this gives you some sense of the work I did as a fellow at the Jackman Humanities Institute. The time away from teaching and other duties allowed me to dive deep into these materials and to develop my analysis in new directions. I found this work to be incredibly interesting and generative, and I'm hugely grateful to the JHI for supporting it. Thank you.